Welcome to Metanoia, My Love, a series of conversations that honor free thinking, created by Nicholas Scudder Thompson, my human clone. This is the first experiment I'm doing, the first episode I'm doing with two guests. With me are, I'm going to read them so I don't mess up. Well, Manuel Tello and our guest of honor, Mrs. Carmen Parraguez. Thanks. If we have time, I'd love for you to tell us the story behind the English grass. But, well, I'm thinking about how to introduce the topic because what happened? This episode was designed to have a conversation with Carmen. And yesterday, at a metanoic gathering we had, where I presented the book and also introduced the podcast series here in Chile, I ran into Manu, and during the after-dinner chat, he told me, I want to participate too. And I said, sure, let's make it happen. Which episode would you like to participate in? And he told me, I want to participate with Carmen. So, I'm putting it out there. I don't know if I had mentioned it before, but I'm putting it out there now, and of course, yes. And go ahead, welcome. Let's get Elio back. We're not going to get bogged down with resumes and all that, but just so the audience can get in the groove. Let's rev up the engines. I wanted to tell you that, Carmen, because she was recently interviewed and they called her Claudia, and now it's my turn, Claudia 2000. Carmen is the director of the School of Body Coaching. Let's talk a little bit about the topic of body ontological coaching. Do we have the book by Rodrigo Rocco Pacheco here? He's one of your teachers, right? And from colleagues, it was the professor, of course. This book that I've chosen to quote some excerpts from and share with the guys. Carmen is also the author of the book Body Coaching, Sees Learning and Change Through the Body. She's a holistic yoga teacher. And well, she's a psychologist. You're a psychologist, Carmen. Let's start there. I don't know if you, Manu, can tell us a little bit about body coaching. Carmen, what it's all about.
Let's see. I had a lot of doubts about what to call this thing I wanted to do. When I started to discover the body as a powerful tool for transformation, I thought, well, what would I call this? It could be called body psychotherapy. It could be called psychocorporal therapy. Coaching, there are a ton of options. I chose the term body coaching because I felt that coaching wasn't necessarily tied to any kind of pathology. Sure, that's good. So it was broader, more open, more geared towards people who wanted to expand possibilities, develop resources, and create paths for growth and transformation. And not necessarily associating it with a pathology, which is something that's generally linked to psychology or psychotherapy. And that's the big distinction between coaching in 2000 and psychotherapy. Well, and body, because I firmly believe that in a culture that's completely focused on the mind, where cognitive understanding is, what prevails, the Aristotelian, logical comprehension of things, the body offers a way to access a different understanding. That doesn't follow logic or doesn't have that kind of logic.
And it combines with, I imagine. In some groups, they talk about having the word and the theme of body expression, the playful aspect through the body. The theatrical, the movement, the dance, let's say, that's what body coaching works on, it works, let's say. Can you tell us what a session would be like? What happens in a body coaching session? Do they go out running, dance while they talk?
How do I work on it? That's great. The model I work with is called SEAS. SEAS means movement, working with movement, attention, body awareness, paying attention to physical sensations, breathing techniques. and its symbolic expression, meaning more from a Jungian perspective, how through the body I can start designing the character that best represents what I want to achieve. I don't know if it's about doing, but about becoming.
Sure, yeah, it's a horizon. Let's say.
Yeah, like in this search, the symbolic expression, having something that symbolizes what I want to articulate, is like the last part of the process. So, to answer your question, the first thing is the diagnosis. It starts with a diagnosis. Not always is body coaching what I use. As a therapist, let's say, and as a coach, I don't always use body coaching. When I assess that through the C's, movement techniques, tension techniques, breathing, we can better reach what the person is looking for, I use it. Sometimes I start without using it, and halfway through I think, maybe this would be good, and sometimes I start with it. So it unfolds based on the diagnosis that I and the person I'm working with are making regarding what they're going through.
That makes sense. It's a school that's used as a tool within a more integral, broader therapeutic approach. It reminds me, and you can jump in whenever you want, Manu. It reminds me I was lucky enough to do it with a teacher who was leading her first group after graduating, but she was an older woman, let's say around 50 years old, not a kid, a junior just, starting out. She was just beginning in the discipline of biodanza. I don't know if you've heard of biodanza. And again, there's an approach there. I mean, the definition I like. Most about biodanza is that it's a physical and emotional reconnection with your body and with your species. Where you, through this, well, now first the circle of words. You had the circle of words, where everyone, if they wanted to, shared with the rest how they felt and how they had felt during the week. And it took us 2 or 3 sessions to understand the difference between sharing how you felt and sharing what you did during the week. I, one of the more mental, more rational ones in the group, probably had the hardest time moving from talking about what I did to, how I felt, beyond what I did. One of the rules was, no follow-up questions, no interruptions. When it's your turn, you don't talk about what just got said, no opinions. You just accept and support the other person in their catharsis. Then she says, well, and that lasts a full hour. There were 12 or 13 of us, a full hour of the circle of words. Then we would pause the sharing, and that's when we would move into the class. And Gabby would do 3 hours of class. There were 4 in total. She would tell us, don't tell my teacher, because ethically it should really be 2.5 hours. I don't know what. But hey, I do it for 4, And it's incredibly therapeutic. Without having that therapeutic vibe.
Exactly. Well, in biodanza, for example. In the C's, we use a lot of biodanza tools. And we call it relational body work. In other words, when you work on connecting with another person through the body, understood as group work, where you look, touch, hug, and connect, it's about the bond. In this diagnosis, it might reveal a need to integrate something missing in self-integration, the relational aspect. Therefore, the exercises we do are those used in biodanza. So, in this diagnosis I was talking about, it might come up that this person has a need to integrate using the expression you use. Something that's missing in their self-integration is the relational aspect. So, the exercises we do are the kind used in biodanza. I mean, I'm not going to work with that person alone, but if I'm not doing birth groups, I'll recommend they try biodanza. In fact, there's a work plan. Sure, for other people, even itchy. For other people in skin boxing, you need to hit. Fitness, yoga, integrate what you least want to do. For others, it's yoga. The interesting thing is that, most of the time, what people need to integrate is the very thing they least want to do. So, if what you really wanted was to dance with someone and be all huggy, that's not what you actually need. Or the other way around, it's not that I can't stand yoga because it's too slow, or Tai Chi because I get into it. It's just what you have to do.
And don't even get me started if you struggle to meditate. If you find it hard to, just pause for a few seconds, because then there's the whole issue of actually achieving it and all that. But it's really great that you brought up the concept of integration. It's a concept that subtitles my book, and I appreciate you bringing it up. And just yesterday, the day before yesterday, I was reading the book by Rocco Pacheco called Living in Gerund. Here it is. He's talking here about the fundamental tools of body ontological coaching. He says body ontological, reminding us that it's ontological. And well, there are 4 points. The first is to find your personal center and break it down. The second one is to step out of the illusion of comfort, of normalcy, which is kind of what you were saying. And here's one, the last two are really going to resonate with me because it talks about committing to yourself to live in a constant movement of generative learning. That involves being comfortable navigating uncertainty, solving and deciding without recipes, being confident in who you are and what you've done, being sensitive to listen to the signals of your own nature, living attentively, present, available, and clear-headed. And I'll wrap up with this last point, number 4, which is to develop the art of relating. That chooses integration as a fundamental path. Integration understood as a shared experience, first of all, is only sustainable at a high level of awareness. Second, it includes acceptance, humility, respect, inclusion, the ability to forgive, gratitude, trust, compassion, flexibility, clarity of dignity, and of course, human love. I thought it was beautiful, exactly.
For me, the concept of flexibility is really essential. Of course, because in this thing of living in the present, of being here, now, of being present, because the body is what gives you presence, the occupation of space, the volume you take up on the stage of existence. And we are faced with uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen in 5. We just assume. Flexibility is essential to not break. It's like a palm tree. The resilience of that palm tree that manages to navigate, or as Susanna Block would say, surf the emotional wave of life requires a certain flexibility. And body coaching, from my perspective, works particularly on that. If I have a range from 1 to 10 that moves between 1 and 8, if something in life triggers me to pull resources from 8 to 10, and I don't have that available, I'm going to be in trouble. And I think life, I don't know why, tends to do that to us much more often than we'd like, putting us in uncomfortable situations, at least at some stage of life. And that largely causes suffering. It's like that inability to adapt to what you're facing. And body coaching works really well. Sure. Super good.
And if everything's great, we make it up. We don't make it up.
The mind is in charge of torturing our existence.
I wanted to ask you about that because when it comes to suffering and fears, there's kind of a comfort zone. In neurosis, paranoia, insecurity, and depression, let's say it is what it is. And I ask you, Manu, in particular, because from what I know about you, you have had. This is what we talked about yesterday, you've had. Since you were very young, a feeling that's very optimistic, very generative, very positive. I don't know what adjective to use for life. An attitude, I insist, a prism or a filter. Is that right? Or am I exaggerating?
No, you're right. It has to do with a daily way of living. Life, which for me means that when you get checkmated in a chess game, you have to see all the first moves. You have to try not to get checkmated. And that relates to the moves you make on the board. And that move will determine how many more moves can be made. The ability to look ahead at how many more moves will also affect that piece. And that has to do with the moves you make on the board. And that move will determine how many more moves can be made. The ability to look ahead at how many more moves will also affect that piece. In a way, I see the path that way too. Every action, every movement that one makes somehow relates to the environment and will have a rebound. And the beauty, or what I'm professionally interested in passing on to the kids I work with, or the young people, has to do with building muscle too. That life can be pretty dark at times, as we all know. But we need to have the ability, and some call it faith, to seek out solutions. Everything has a solution. But we need to have the ability, and some call it faith, to seek out solutions. Everything has a solution. Death is the one thing that has no solution, but any problem. I work with kids from vulnerable backgrounds who deal with issues every day, like gunfire, deaths, carjackings, which are a big deal here in Chile, and drug dealers who are constantly pressuring them to join their gangs, and so on. Why do I use that as an example? Because in a way, in the workshops we've created in our organization, we've made it a point to show these kids that they're not just vulnerable because of their economic situation, but they're also vulnerable in terms of the education they've received, both from their families and formally in school. Therefore, they face a double violation of their rights, at least 7. So in that context, where we find kids who are in a wonderful process of discovering the world and relating to it, we often come across islands with kids who, many times, the one in front has never talked to the one sitting in the back, even after 4 years of being classmates. And in the workshops we run, we try to break that barrier, because we find that many times the kid in the front row can write a great script for a video, and the one in the back row is really good at handling the camera. So it creates an integration of people who have never spoken before, and they come together to develop a common project. Therefore, I really liked integration from a very young age, before becoming a professional. Bringing together a friend who's an architect with a musician, or a violinist with a sketch artist, that's something I've been practicing in these workshops. It's about trying to create or seek out those conversations that aren't very common or that would never happen. Unless there's a situation where someone says, hey, I'm also interested in video, I want to make a mural, but I have the idea, I just can't paint it. Another kid who wants to make a comic, but isn't good at drawing, and the classmate she's never talked to draws really well. So, in a way, we've discovered that achieving that integration in the classroom creates a sense of identity. Identity, in my case, which relates to a project aimed at preventing violence among school kids, is essential because it allows each child to position themselves within a social space. With the tools we provide, we give them the opportunity to talk about the things that bother them, like bullying, whether it's because they're overweight, short, or an immigrant. Conversations. I talk. You want to make a mural, you want to write a poem, you want to make a video, you want to do an interview. From my understanding of communication, I believe that when we establish communication, we take a big step forward. It's about agreeing on those points that make us uncomfortable in order to create change. If we're isolated on an island, it's really tough to create change. If you manage to bring other people together in an audio-visual project, in a song, in a mural, you're working together. There's an exchange of experiences. And I go even further. We also use, and I want to go back to the physical aspect, because when we face school communities that often don't know us, seeing us only 2 or once a week, there are ways and techniques to break those ice barriers and build trust. With 10-year-old kids who are really hurt, one very effective way is through physical activity, or getting them to meditate, or doing a dance game. So, within the team, we include someone I call the emotional workshop leader, who uses techniques from theater, which, as far as I know, are the easiest to share with people especially kids. They help them get closer to recognizing their own emotions. When that recognition of one's own emotions happens, you can start to have a conversation. And when you start to be able to have a conversation, that resonates with someone else who went through the same thing. And that's how the collective is built. The rest of it is channeled through a video, a mural, or a written work. That's the channel. The important thing is to create cohesion.
And what kind of challenges or patterns of challenges do you find? So, what's the crux of it? Let's say that first burst of creativity, of exposure, of putting yourself in a vulnerable position in front of someone else? I mean, you're already coming from a pretty unfriendly, unkind, and unempathetic context, and they're asking you to sing or dance.
Corrections, sorry, the spaces are really brutal. When I get involved in this project, it's because I can't compromise on certain things. And one of those things I won't compromise on is the violence that's normalized in our educational spaces, which should be places of welcome and communication. And that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen in Chile, and it doesn't happen in Argentina, and it doesn't happen in Peru, and unfortunately, it doesn't happen in many educational spaces across America. I'm not familiar with the phenomenon in Europe. They probably need to focus on different types of issues, different kinds of things.
Are you referring to bullying or something more systemic?
I'm talking about all the faces of violence, which isn't just bullying. There's the issue of immigrants, LGBT violence, and there's gender violence. That becomes very present, especially in children, who replicate what they see. If the model to be replicated is a failed, harmful, negative model, it's obvious that they will replicate that model. And it doesn't exist. In schools in Chile, plain and simple. Spaces, generations of meetings where children can talk about these issues. Not just talking, but creating a viral piece within the school community. In a school of 1,000 kids, we work with 30, but the project benefits everyone through presentations. We also present at nearby schools with similar realities, sharing a prevention message created by the kids in their language and style. This creates a mirror effect where kids recognize themselves. And not just the presentation at that school, but we can go to the school that's 4 blocks away, where there are other similar realities, and where we show a prevention message that isn't generated by us, but by the kids themselves, meaning their peers. It's expressed in the way kids talk, painted with the colors they use, or if it's acted out, it's done with the clothes that kids usually wear. So, something is created, that I called a mirror effect, when you look in the mirror and start to recognize yourself.
Yeah, that's true. And then the other one, which also relates to the mirror, is mimesis. I mean, I have a daughter who's about to turn 4. You guys probably have more experiences. Older kids, I imagine.
1 or 2. I became a dad young.
Became a dad young, right? A daughter.
I have a 26 years old daughter. 26.
I remember clearly, like a goose, seeing its mother. Ainara, my daughter, makes me present my best self. If I don't, I mess up. She's there, reminding me. Well, that's really true. In a lot of things, in how you respond. That's why this Ainara, her name is Ainara Bahia Ainara, my daughter, kind of forces me to show my best self. Because if I don't, I mess up. If I don't, she's right there. And it's something that seems obvious, but you have to remind yourself of it all the time. There, constantly trying to understand what's happening around them. What we're going to do is also like, if you splash water, the water doesn't just get you wet, it falls down. Or like the age of things, because you shouldn't squirt lemon juice in your eye. You know. I've had to learn it the hard way, but we got it now. They're at that moment where they're figuring out the laws of physics. Because, in effect, of little everyday things, there's this. American communicator Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's great, he's an astrophysicist, kind of like a Carl Sagan for our generation. The guy talks about his children and says clearly, children are scientists. They are always experimenting. The boy goes to the kitchen and grabs the pots and starts hitting them. Parents think that this kid is a bit of a jerk, that he's leaving things behind, that he's making noise, that I don't know what. Elena is doing a study on sound acoustics, comparing frequencies, and you can't just throw around all these fancy words on purpose. Because the kid was experimenting. So, this and that. In a house where you have a father, two fathers, a mother, where there is paternal and maternal presence, interest, vocation, and passion for educating, it is already difficult.
Consider what it's like for a child who faces rejection and punishment. At home, leave me alone. How can they not feel crushed? This results from poor upbringing. Or the classroom where disqualification is present in all communication. How can their spirit not be crushed? And that's a result of the poor upbringing that child had. That kid isn't to blame for hitting another one. It's because he didn't have a different role model. And that's really serious, because they're the next adult citizens who are going to live alongside us. So, we can't be scared or surprised, more than scared, by the crime rates that come out of here. It's obvious that it happens. It's really appealing to be a criminal or a member of a drug gang. What's the other option you have? Either you're a soccer player, or you're an urban music singer, or you're a drug dealer, or you end up breaking your back, as they say in Chile, working for minimum wage. So, it's quite a complex situation we're dealing with. And it's been quite a while. I've been working on this for 14 years, and I haven't been taken into account the way I should have been. So, a lot of times I think that, like I said yesterday, I can't remember if I mentioned it to you. It's part of the perversion of the model. The economic model were part of benefits from these violations against children. Is that part of how the model works?
Yeah, and I like listening to Carmen, or also how Tyson talks about it. He mentioned war. How now you just press a button to kill someone, and even before that, you're far away. And don't see the impact of your actions or the effect of your shot. It's become a completely deplorable, totally pointless activity, but now it's also cowardly. And the system, I don't know if it benefits from it, but without a doubt, it designed or redesigned. Since we're part of the system, the mechanisms to not see. So, by not seeing, you can go on with your life and all, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It doesn't mean you have to carry the weight on your shoulders. And here I go back a bit to coaching and the ontological stuff, and the Gestalt approach. If you want, we can also throw in a little bit of mixing there. How do you avoid, on one hand, being indifferent, and on the other hand, not falling into overwhelming empathy? I mean, it's like having so much empathy or compassion, or even, let's say, sensitivity towards others, that it actually blocks you, overwhelms you, and brings you down. I close with this idea. A colleague illustrated the circle of concern and influence. A large concern circle with a small influence circle leads to frustration. Adjust them so influence matches where you can make a difference. So when you have this huge circle of concern, but a tiny circle of influence, as a gardener in Chile, be realistic and adjust sizes so influence matches areas you can impact. Instead, you have to try to be realistic and adjust those sizes so that the circle of influence is as close in size as possible to the areas where you can actually intervene. For example,
There's an interesting difference between the concept of empathy and the concept of compassion, which can also help in this regard. And I've worked on that quite a bit. I work a lot in the healthcare field with clinics, hospitals, and teams that deal with death. One of the things that happens with healthcare staff who work with death and pain is that they experience burnout. And that's where we really focus on the distinction, because generally it's said and recommended that it's really good to be empathetic, to put yourself in the other person's shoes, to connect with what they're feeling in order to provide better support, whether it's physical if you're healthcare staff or psychological. And that's where we work hard on distinction, because generally, it's said and recommended that it's really good to be empathetic, to put yourself in the other person's shoes, to connect with what they're feeling, in order to provide better support, whether it's physical if you're healthcare staff, or psychological. And Eastern philosophies develop a concept of accompanying someone in a good death, which comes from Buddhism, and it relates to the idea of compassion. It makes a distinction that I find interesting, which is that in order for me to be available and to be of service, if I have the capacity for it, and if I have the talents and resources to help the other person, I don't necessarily have to put my body and soul through the same pain that the other person is experiencing, which would be the concept of empathy, where I have to put myself in their place. So, if the other person is suffering, and if I'm not suffering, or at least not in part, something similar, then I won't be able to be of service. It's not necessary. So, if the other person is suffering, and if I'm not suffering, or at least not in some similar way, then I won't be able to be of service. It's not necessary. Because, you see, empathy is also a movement of the ego. Why should I have to put myself in the other person's shoes? What if I'm not in the other person's shoes? The other person is the main character in their own place, in their own life. It's like I would be taking away the spotlight from their life and putting myself or others in it. How terrible it would be if this happened to my child. How awful. Or this is like when my grandpa died, or this reminds me of that. So it's like I start using the other person's life story to be able to be of service.
You don't need to do that. You wouldn't be able to live in peace.
And if I realize that it's not necessary, then from compassion, I make a different move. The issue is about the other person, not about me. And I make a clear distinction and set a protective boundary, which is what you were saying there. But I do make myself available with all the resources, with all the talents that I have to be of service to that person.
Sure, that's perfect.
And I don't burn out.
And don't burn out. That's the key one. Like they used to tell me when I volunteered at a maternal home, they'd say, Nico, I know you want to come 3 days a week, but just come one, because if you come 3 days a week, it's happened to us before, don't take it personally, but people get bored after a month and they leave. They get bored, they feel overwhelmed, and they're embarrassed to say they're coming less. If you promise one, just one, you're going to stick to it, and you'll come with enthusiasm and all that. And the other thing is, that compassion is empathy in action, or empathy with action, which is not exactly what I think you're saying. It's even clearer. I'm doing the survival thing, of course, because I think about it from the perspective of the nurse. The doctor, the person who's there, if you're going to get sensitive, you're going to get emotional. You're going to feel everything that happens when you feel what the other person feels with each of the interactions. You go crazy. You go crazy.
You can't. Look, I've asked the question when they say no. It's that I ask them, when did you feel that? Remember the moment. Well, what were you thinking about? And almost, more than 90% of the time, you're thinking about something personal. I remembered when I was in school, and I went through, why did I remember that? This 2001. I mean, he took the leading role in the movie.
Yeah. It's almost like saying, no, I'm going to follow the 10 Commandments, because if not, God is going to punish me.
Instead of saying, because I remember my dad was punished by God for not doing it.
Of course. It's wrong, period. You can't build morality on rewards and punishments. That's for the pets. And not even because it's not even necessary with them. Manu, I think you want to say something. Well, I grab you a bit more water, and also for myself. And then when Manu is missing. The Gestalt aspect, Gestalt practices, let's dive a little into that. Tell us how Gestalt and how you integrate it with forgiveness, with body coaching. Has a lot, it has a lot of connection.
They complement each other really well. In psychology, there are different theoretical orientations, and each theoretical orientation develops a set of methods, techniques, or tools for working with the patient. And Gestalt, in particular, develops what are called psychodramatic techniques. Among many others, similar to theater techniques, very similar, and they develop them because for Gestalt, integration is important again, taking the term why into account between the mental, cognitive, emotional, and physical aspects. And very particularly, the focus is on the experience, and the experience understood as the emotion, and the embodiment of that emotion. It's more about how I experience reality, what happens to me, and not so much how I think about it. Gestalt doesn't focus as much on belief systems like other theoretical lines do. Instead, it really emphasizes experience. It's not that it disregards belief, but it really focuses on experience, because the premise is that in the end, the experience completes you. And this has to do with a German term that has many translations, but it's like the whole, it's like the one, it's like the completeness of something. The completeness of something, the way that completes something. Well, the experience is the way that completes that something. So for Gestalt, change happens not just when you understand something like, oh yeah, I get it, this has to do with what happened to me as a kid, and you realize it, but you still act the same way, you're still in the same role. In Gestalt, you experience. And that would be the difference for some between understanding something and comprehending something. And the understanding is bodyism. And when you embody it, that's where the connection with body coaching comes in.
You were talking about how great it is. You mentioned psychodrama, and for me, one of the things I've witnessed, the exercise, several times, and it's fascinating when the prompt is father and daughter. So you play the daughter, and the father plays the daughter. In a scene, they always fight in the kitchen at mealtime for some reason. Well, let's see, do the role play. But then you bring in the body, and that's when you feel the experience. But it also starts out as a caricature with that, and then they start to take it seriously. And suddenly, the girl finds herself defending the father's arguments, but she's already doing it, even with her body. And the father too. And it's an excellent way to understand what the other person feels.
But it's a full understanding.
Integral.
Not from here.
Exactly. And that reminds me of what we talked about doing in the event, in the meeting. This thing about neuroplasticity. So, neuroplasticity. Probably understanding something, rationalizing something, absorbing some information might add 1 or 2 connections in the brain. But when you incorporate experiences, when you take in a concept, it's a whole new network that gets created.
Absolutely. There's a guy who wrote a book called Conscious Movement and Autonomy, which is a discipline that works on that. They suggest that the brain is like a Christmas tree. It's like the lights. Some are on in the recurrence of the things I learned to do. So that's lit up. 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4. And the others are turned off. But when you do certain specific exercises that take you out of your routine, like, I don't know, brushing your teeth with the other hand, getting up from the other side of the bed, writing with your other hand, that's when the lights in the brain start to turn on, like new synaptic pathways begin to form. You can also do it this way, and what they suggest is that as we age, the brain essentially conserves energy. Because if every time I go to grab a glass of water, I had to think about how to take it so it doesn't spill, it would be a whole process. I just go and grab it. Exactly. But as we get older, we fill up with more and more automatism, and that's when we start to become rigid. So you have to kind of go back and face the world as if it were new at every moment to get the lights on the Christmas tree to light up.
Yeah, like stretching the brain, let's put it that way. Just like we need to do body stretching.
A
brain trek, for sure.
To open yourself up to new experiences.
Yeah, it's not just because you associate with good culture, a work of art, right? But also by challenging yourself, like you said. I brush my teeth with the other hand. I'm left-handed. So maybe you do it with your right. This. Getting out of your comfort zone, taking a different route to the office.
And there are a lot of physical exercises too that help you expand, broaden.
You remind me, remember the movie Dead Poets Society, when the teacher Robin Williams, may he rest in peace. It's a good case, and if you're up for it, we can talk a bit about suicide. But the character asks the kids to stand up. These days it's a cliche, but back then I remember was pretty revolutionary. And the thing is, the movie was set even further back in time. But he asks them to stand up in a school, like we say in Argentina, pipi caca. Very aristocratic. England, the U to S.
Look at the room from a new view.
Exactly. Change the...
That alters all.
It changes everything. That's when neuroplasticity gets activated. I remember I was at... I don't know if you know about Burning Man. The Burning Man Festival. It's a festival, probably. I don't know if the tech guys have heard of Burning Man. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, Daniel Sal is like the mecca of electronic parties. But we're talking 70,000 people during that week. Black Rock City, which is a huge campsite with buses and tents and stuff, becomes the second most populated city in Nevada at that level, after Reno. Everyone pays to get in, even the performances, the dishes, everything. There are people who spend 4 months building installations and whatnot. Well, actually that's not the case. It's a beautiful festival that you can go, that it's one of a kind in the world. But anyway, that's when I found out there's a temple. There's a temple that all of that gets set on fire later because it's made of wood. And then the last 2 days, 3 days, everything gets set on fire and it's wild. There's a liturgy behind that, a tradition. There's a symbol too. And in the temple, you go to meditate, you go to rest. It's all about silence. It's a huge structure. Now they're making them with lasers. And it started with the D, some incredible things. And people go, they stick a little photo of their relatives who have passed away, and they write little things on the wall, and send them wishes, and all that. And then that gets burned. And there, I saw the photo from 2014. I saw the photo of Robin. And it was like, what is this guy doing in this context? And I ask, if someone had put up a big photo, standing on some kind of altar, and there was the photo of Robin, which, you know, there are many others too, but he kind of embodied that. The sad clown, right? At some point, I don't know if you knew that in the Russian clown school. Yesterday, I answered you. When you said you didn't like clowns, you don't like clowns. Guys, some of them had been scared. Traditionally, Russian clowns paint a tear on their eye, and it's like... You know that photo of the clown when they're putting on or taking off their makeup after the show with that sad face? There's something there. And Robin Williams is like the epitome of that because he lived with depression his whole life. Addiction is a consequence, but he lived with depression. He said that there is an epic, historic stand-up show of his, which is recorded from the spectator's point of view, and it is something that marks a before and after in the history of stand-up. And he says, I wanted to kill myself. Before going on stage, during the performance, when I left, I went back to the dressing room, I wanted to go to bed, I wanted to take a sleeping pill, and just not exist. And you say, how can that be? So what he was showing was, well, the show must go on, right? That's why I have so much respect for him, for a bunch of reasons, but mainly because I, as a therapeutic companion, have worked a lot with depressed patients and addicts, and also with cases in my family. So I keep that very much in mind. Back to this thing about empathy. I have empathy for him because it reminds me of my own stuff. Now I feel a little guilty, but well, it shouldn't be necessary. 2001 is missing, but hey, here we are. I threw in the one about Robin, but we can go another way if you want.
Instead of Batman, the one about robbery, for example.
How are we doing on time, Danny? Postek. I think it's a good time, Manu, to ask Carmen about comparative mythologies.
You couldn't. Let her go.
No. When I did a little research on her, just to get to know Carmen before actually meeting her, I found out that she took a diploma course with Margarita Ovalle, who is the professor and a Jungian psychologist at the Catholic University.
Sure, it started as workshops on mythology, which I was really interested in. I had read about mythology, and later I found out it was called Olympic in Greek mythology, from an American Jungian psychiatrist named Chinota Bolin, who has come to Chile. And she has, as far as I know, 3 books. The Goddesses of Every Woman, which was the first one I read, and The Goddesses of Women After 50, something like that, and The Gods of Every Man. So what she does is take the goddesses from Greek mythology, Aphrodite, Artemis, Athena, Hera, and creates a psychological profile for them. And what she suggests is that these Greek Olympic goddesses would be archetypes of ways of being for women that were shaped by the wisdom of the time and embodied in these goddesses in order to represent these archetypal female personalities that have existed throughout history. The archetype of the mother, the archetype of the wife, the archetype of the daughter, the fragile, vulnerable maiden who needs help, etc. The same thing happened with men with Zeus. That's what I was doing, and I was running workshops where I explored these archetypes. And with this idea of integration that Chinota Bolin presents, well, imagine that your psyche is an Olympic table where all your goddesses are seated. It's good, but some are awake and others are sleeping. The mother is very awake, but Aphrodite is asleep. The sensual woman is dozing off. To complete you, to integrate you, let's wake up Aphrodite. That work of completion, I don't know if that word exists. Or of completeness. Or to increase the flexibility. Let's get back to flexibility. As an important part of the integration, we work with the body. So in these workshops, we developed the work with the different archetypes. And the body of Aphrodite, the posture, the movement, the breathing is not the same as the body of Hera, who is the goddess of the wife, for example. It's also not the same body as Persephone, who is the princess, the damsel in distress, the maiden in trouble. And that's a very theatrical work too.
8,001.
If you were to say right now, imagine, close your eyes, imagine that you're Zeus. What does Zeus's body look like at this moment? Close your eyes and start. Exactly. So, or Dionysus. So that was the work I was doing. And then, well, I saw this diploma program that Margarita was doing, comparative mythology. Well, that's when I got into something much deeper, because she works a lot more with archaic mythology. And also, all the mythologies, since it's called a diploma in comparative mythology, you make connections between myths from certain places, like Egyptian mythology, from indigenous countries, Mayans, Aztecs, and you start to realize that there are certain similarities. And there appears, for example, the archetype of the hero, which you realize crosses through from Gilgamesh in the Popol Vuh. Exactly.
Yeah, me too. When you were talking, the topic of dreams came to my mind too. All these images that pop up unconsciously, and somehow some of them leave a mark on your everyday life. How do those things mix? The topic of dream interpretation with goddesses, for example, a lot because they are represented in some way.
Dreaming is a dream content and therefore symbolic. You dream about something, but you're not necessarily representing literally what you dreamed. I can dream that I have a baby, I'm a mother, and I neglect her. And not necessarily because I'm neglecting my baby, but it could symbolize that I'm not taking care of my inner child, for example. That I'm not protecting myself from my own fragilities. That I'm exposing myself to situations that make me vulnerable, for instance. That would be an interpretation. And from the archetypes, are you working with the same thing, the symbolic? How does that mix in there?
Tarot, for example, is also a symbolic work of symbolism. Some people think it's random. Giovanni Appibleza, an astrologer who works with the I Ching and tarot cards, likes African tarot cards. He connects the randomness of which card you get with the intuition of the person reading the cards.
In another episode with Giovanni Appibleza, he likes some African cards. He connected the randomness to intuition. He explained his journey as a rational engineer learning to prioritize intuition in card reading. He connected, of course, the randomness, let's say, the random experience for the participant of which card you get. And then the intuition of the person reading the cards. And he explained a bit about his journey with his teachers, how as an engineer, someone quite mathematical and very rational, he had this whole background. The teacher would say he was the best student because he was diligent, but then when it came time to interpret the cards, he was required to give primary importance to intuition. And he even shared that first time he managed to do it because they kind of pushed him. They pushed him to just go for it, and he said whatever came to mind. And finally, he let it out and started saying things, and it was like, well, now you're really reading the cards, the tarot, he said. Finally, he expressed himself, reading the tarot cards. His words are interesting and organic. And finally, he let it out and started saying things, and it was like, well, now you're really reading the cards, the tarot, he said.
And it's interesting what he's saying, because it's an organic movement too. Of course, because what interrupts your intuition is the mind. You take that out and you start to flow. A thought comes up that's super organic, that sometimes, well, it feels like Alan is channeling. It has a lot to do with that. I'm not myself when I get angry. What comes out, let's say, in an organic way, also has to do with the body. That's interesting, a voice that comes from another place and gets it right quite a bit.
Yusin gets it right quite a bit, for sure. Well, there we step into fascinating territory, right? Neither esoteric, because we also define it as reserved, nor mystical, but rather theory, almost magical. And we should define that it's not magical, but it feels magical to me. And at the same time, super logical that in therapy, especially in analytical therapy, but also in general, the patient already knows. The patient has the answer. The therapist just accompanies them on their journey to, let's say, move from the unconscious to the conscious. The answer, let's say, self-knowledge and all that. But what about the other one? When do you have that intuition? Maybe if I tell you, well, reading the cards for Coat, a friend you all know and that I've known for many years. And the cards come out, since I've known him for so long, my intuition has, let's say, a background. It's like an intuition. You could say with academic baggage, so to speak. But someone I don't know, out of nowhere, who sits in front of me for the first time, and I read their cards. That would be pure intuition. Does anyone have an idea of what the explanation is?
Magic doesn't exist anymore.
Sure, that's why I say there's something there. Like the saying goes, any piece of technology you can't explain is similar to magic, something like that. I'm kind of butchering the paraphrase, but you get it? Magic and technology that you don't understand are kind of the same, right? If you take a cell phone, throw it back 200 years, show it to a pilgrim, and that cell phone is magic. In fact, I don't even know how it works, but I get that. Well, there are circuits and stuff, right? But with intuition, with the intuition to be able to, through reading the cards or the symbol, in this case, the cards get the other person to draw out. because you throw the cards and the other person also has to interpret that. I've had my cards read a couple of times. Actually, it's 3 cards, so it represents the past, present, and future, or it depends. It's always divided. So it's like, at least from what I remember, the middle card is like the central card, and the card on the left is the one that, let's say, represents the why, where you're coming from. And the card on the right is the for what, right? Where are you headed? And based on the 3 cards that come up for you, and whether they're upside down or not, the line that the tarot reader gives you is a pretty concrete line. But where does that concreteness, that coming together, come from? We're inventing a new language. We didn't just throw out Spitausendian without thinking. Where does it come from? It's an open question. Not rhetorical, but open. From someone who's pretty skeptical, someone who's going through a journey, giving astrology and card reading a chance, giving it a shot, beyond just a simple silent rejection or diplomatic respect, because I come from that background. Honestly, I really do. And well, people like my friend Giovanni have made me give this whole thing another chance, I don't know. How are we doing? We're good, right? More or less. Well, I think it's a good time for a break. Let's go with the tarot. Very good. Exactly. And with an open question that doesn't necessarily have to have an answer in this episode. Guys, thank you so much. It was great having you, Manu. Thank you, Carmen. Thanks for coming. An honor. And I'll tell you, the tradition is a hug with a guest, but since there are 3 of us, are you up for a triple hug?
A biodanza exercise.
There it is. He's going to say the same thing. Good. Well, a lot of dancing. This was Metanoia, my love, the era of integration. To learn more about this series and find out what's coming up, subscribe and hit that bell hard. Namaskar, cheers, and good luck.